Hi, my name is Findlay Wolfe and I'm a licensed designer with Sizzix. Fast, easy, versatile, that's what you're going to find in this next diamond sampler. Options. I love to have options, and if I can get as many different options in one die, that's the thing that's going to give me so many things to play with. So let's look at all the different variations that we're going to be able to do with Diamond Sampler. Okay, so you'll notice the quilt behind me. We have lots of different blocks. So first off, we have this large diamond with the half rectangle corner pieces that go on the outside. Then we have this half rectangle outside piece is actually, if you sew 4 of those together, gives you a 4 patch in the inside. I love that, using the same piece to give you a different effect. And then up here at the top, we have small diamonds to do a little 9 patch within the diamond. And again, using that half rectangle shape to finish out your squares. You can just play with a whole different pile of color and fabric, cut out 8 layers at a time and have a parts department so that you can just play and make variations. And here we just use blues, turquoises, some light greens, and some light white fabrics to give you some interesting movement and depth within the quilt. All right, so let's look at how we put some of these blocks together. Like I said, fast, easy, and versatile. That's the thing that's so awesome about this die. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get some pieces cut out. I'm taking a light and a dark fabric right at the same time because I'm going to need all of those pieces. We do have the 2 half square triangles down here on the end of the die, or rectangles, half rectangles, so that you can lay just a portion of fabric across if you want to have that light bit. I'm going to use both of them because I want to be able to use all of the different parts and just mix them up. Okay. I'm using the Big Shot Plus machine for this today. You can also use your Big Shot Pro. And I have some pieces that are already laid out nicely here that we're going to play with. Okay, so there I have some extra parts. I have lots of other extra pieces that I've already cut that I can just use to mix and match all of my different pieces to get some cool blocks. All right, so let's look at the big diamond first and how we're sewing these half rectangles on the outside. Okay. You'll notice on these shapes, we have a dog ear that's already cut off. That's for ease of construction. I can see exactly where I need to line that up. That also shows you, and I'm going to flip this over so you can see this, one of the biggest things that I find people have the hardest time figuring out is when you do have a dog ear that lands on the outside edge of your block, where does that go? How much fabric needs to lie out there? You're actually looking for where this angle of the piece of the dog ear that's coming out, where it meets with the green fabric on the top, should be at your 1/4 inch. Meaning, when I put that underneath my sewing machine and my needle goes in the fabric, right at that point is where I need to have 2 pieces of fabric. I don't want to have it back here. If I show you this exaggerated, if I pull it back here, now you can see that that navy blue is meeting way back here at the green. If I started sewing my 1/4 inch, I clearly don't have 2 layers of fabric. So understanding where that needs to lay means you're going to have success on finishing any of your blocks so that when you open that up, you have a straight line going all the way across. If that's not straight, that means you did not line it up correctly. So understanding where that dog ear needs to lie is going to make any piecing you do beyond this a breeze, because you're going to always have accurate piecing construction just by knowing where to lay that dog ear. All right. I'm going to go ahead and just put a pin in, and when I work on this, I'm going to do opposite sides first, and then I'll put the other 2 opposite sides on afterwards. Just pinning that in place. Like I said, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to go ahead and just pin the other ones on. That way I can just stitch one side, stitch the other. Because these pieces are cut properly, as long as you get this first part lined up accurately, this is going to go exactly where it needs to lie as well. So don't pull and stretch your fabrics. Just leave it where it lies. You can check it to make sure that that angle is exactly at your 1/4 inch where you need it to be, and put a pin in that and hold it. Now, I often find people like to line up the beginning and then they just sew and not worry about the end lineup. Always line up your starts and your stops so that you'll have perfectly pieced blocks. I'm starting with a smaller shape on top. I just like to be able to see to make sure that my fabrics haven't moved, everything is laying where it's supposed to. Always do my little back stitch. and just sew my straight seam at 1/4 inch. Having pinned the other one on, I can just flip it around and do the other side. And now we can pin the other two on the opposite sides. So again, lining up, we have a dog ear that's already in place. You'll notice that my seam allowance, because I've pressed it out, that's giving me my guide so I know where to line up this next dog ear. It lies exactly on top of what is showing out on that side. So taking the time to make that line up means that when you've sewn this and you open this back up, as we do on here, you are going to have 1/4 inch of fabric beyond that point of the block. That's what you're looking for. So if you don't have that, then you need to fix it really, because if you don't have that 1/4 inch, we want that 1/4 inch because when I go to sew these blocks together, I need a 1/4 inch on either side. I pin those units, I sew my 1/4 inch, and I'm not going to sew off any points. That's the whole key to not sewing off your points on any block, is understanding how to line up your dog ear. Now it's the same thing on this one, on the other end where that little pointy dog ear is. I previously have one from my first seam. That's already there. That tells me exactly where I need to line that up. And that'll be perfect. There's the block. See that 1/4 inch of blue beyond that green? That is perfectly pieced. That's going to give you success that when you're sewing your blocks together that you're never going to sew off that point or have a big gap between there. That's exactly how you want it to look. So just by that little dog ear that we put on the die just makes your piecing such a breeze. So these are very easy blocks to do. On this next block I want to show you, we're actually making these sort of half rectangles, squares. We'll make those squares first and then we'll sew those 4 units together. Okay, again when we lay these together, this time the first piece has the dog ear. It nestles right in there. We see that the point is coming off. We'll put a pin in and then we'll check on the other side for lining up on that. That again, understanding where that dog ear lies, and going ahead and putting that pin in to hold it. And we're going to go ahead and we'll pin all 4 of those units so that we can zip these straight through the machine and then sew the block together. Now that we have our 4 sections of the half rectangle sewn together, now we're going to finish the construction. So do 2 pieces together and then the bottom 2 together. We'll sew those units first and then we'll finish the final seam. So lining these up, your seam allowances should match up very nicely. You can just go ahead and put a pin through that and hold it in its place, making sure to line up your top and your bottom. Always remember to line up your start and your stop at the end. And my seams are all pressed to the dark side, so I don't have that shadowing going on. Do my little back stitch, sewing my 1/4 inch. And I can chain piece those, again, just running them all straight through the machine at the same time. Now when I'm pressing that seam, I want to make sure, I'm going to end up nestling them together, so I want to make sure that I press one seam to the left and the other seam to the right. That way when I go ahead and I'm going to nestle this together this way, my middle seam, that way I have it nice and flat because one seam allowance is going to that way and one is going that way. Right? When I pin that, I like to pin, as a habit, 1/4 inch through the seam so that I know that I'm lining up these seams perfectly one at a time, and 1/4 inch through that second seam. Okay, so by putting that pin in 1 seam at a time, every time when I do it, those seams are going to line up perfectly. Love that when that happens. Okay, so seeing it from this side, you can see finishing it, I press my last seam open just so that everything will lay nice and flat on the back. And there's our block. That's the second version. Now let's look at the last version. Pull this up here a little bit. What we're actually doing with these little diamonds are actually making a little 9 patch. So we're just going to go ahead and sew these into 3 rows and then join the rows together. When we're lying these together, now we know again about that dog ear. that we're looking for the angle of the blue where it's hitting my white fabric should be at 1/4 inch. If you're not sure what 1/4 inch looks like, then you take your ruler and make a little mark on there, then you'll start visually being able to go, okay, that's about right. But we're looking for, so if that's my needle, when I go to put my needle in the fabric, I want 2 layers of fabric at that point. The thing to understand about a dog ear is that that amount of fabric will change depending on the angles in which you're sewing different pieces and blocks together. So if you're doing curves, it's going to be different. If you're doing half square triangles, it's going to be different. So it's always looking for where you're making a connection so that you have 2 layers of fabric at 1/4 inch from your raw edge. So now that we know we have that one lined up where we want, I'm just going to drop 1 pin into that. And I can actually do my first section of these, pin these together, and then just chain piece them, meaning chain them one, sew them under your machine one after the other. Again, I like that back stitch. I always start with my back stitch. I don't want to have to come back, spend time to repair a seam later. I just want to have it secure right off the bat. I always like to lay it back out so that I don't start sewing something wrong. I want to be able to lay it there and look at it and make sure I know what I'm sewing together. Okay, I have them pressed. I pressed all my seam allowances to the dark side. Now we need to sew these 3 rows together. And we're going to pin, again, at those little intersections that we need, 1/4 inch into the first seam, 1/4 inch into the second seam. I've double checked where I'm going to sew that next row on, make sure it's the right pieces, right sides together. Pin through the intersection, 1/4 inch through the seam, and into the second seam. Make sure I have that 1/4 inch from my raw edge where the fabrics are intersecting. And now I can go ahead and sew that last seam. So I have my seams pressed on the back. The last seams are pressed open, so everything will lay nice and flat. And now we're going to drop our opposite sides together first. The half rectangles on the outside. Remembering that that little dog ear lines up perfectly with the straight edge of the block you've just sewn together. And we know what to do on this end. We got to have that little dog ear. And this time it's very tiny, but it lines up with that point. And sew those opposite sides together first. So I can go ahead and pin both ends, and that way I'm just taking it to the machine once. And I'm going to stitch it with the seams on top so that I can make sure that my seams will stay flat on this side, so they're not getting tucked under or folded underneath when I'm sewing it. Okay, these seams will be pressed to the outside of the block. I'm going to just finger press them for now. I think that works great for finishing this block, as long as I know I have that seam allowance pressed to the outside. That is a great trick for ease of construction, because then that means I know exactly where this little dog ear needs to lie, because the seam allowance is exactly what it lays on there, the bit that's sticking out. So the information you need to piece it precisely is right there in front of you. All right. Again, I'll sew it with those seams up so that I get a nice clean block on the back. There's the final block pressed. Seams are all to the outside. The block lays really lovely. There's 3 different versions of blocks that have all been done with just 1 die. I love that versatility. So you can play with variations. You could just use 1 block, or you could do a whole quilt just even out of some of these parts. So you have the option to even have more choices when you're sewing those blocks together. Maybe it's just going to be a half rectangle block. Maybe you're just going to use the little diamonds and make a whole postage stamp quilt. You have the sky is the limit when you're playing with this die. Have fun.